So, here we are in the heart of London, a world capital. And there's a lot that's very good about that. Let's think, it's a cultural powerhouse, it's an all-night party venue. Realistically, I don't get to see much of those two at the moment because I have a 2-year-old, but I understand that other people are enjoying them. And of course, it's the economic heart of Britain. Think of all those talented people flocking to London every year looking for work. Some of them head up the road to Soho, trying to get into the creative industries. Some of them head over to Old Street, trying to get into tech. Some of them hang around here, trying to get into politics. And there are plenty who want to follow the money into law and property and finance. But there's a side to London that's less talked about, and it's the role that this city plays in fueling corruption in some of the poorest countries in the world, and the role of some of our bankers, some of our lawyers, and some of our property market in helping that to happen. London is headquarters to HSBC, which was recently fined nearly $2 billion by the US authorities for repeatedly accepting cash that had been laundered by Mexican drug cartels. During the time that HSBC was accepting this dirty cash, 35,000 people died at the hands of the drug gangs in Mexico. London is also home to branches of NatWest, Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays, UBS, and HSBC again, which accepted millions of pounds from corrupt Nigerian state governors who were paying in the bribes that they'd been accepting. London is also home to the High Court, which in a recent case involving a corrupt billion-dollar Nigerian oil deal, decided that one of the middlemen was entitled to a 10% cut, without questioning whether the British court should be dividing up the proceeds of corruption in this way. And London is also home to a property market that's very popular with the roles corrupt. Now, most people think of corruption as something that happens somewhere else. It's over there, and it's nothing to do with us. But what I'm going to talk about is the role of some actors right here in London in helping some of it to happen. Now, I don't know about you, but this makes me feel rather sad and angry. I love London, and there's so much that's good about it, but this all makes me feel rather ashamed. I work for Global Witness, a campaigning organisation that investigates the deep links between natural resources, conflict, corruption, and environmental devastation. We spend half our time as investigative journalists, unpicking the dirty deals and following the money to those responsible. Then we use our findings to campaign for change. My colleague, Charmian Gooch, one of our co-founders, won this year's TED Prize. TED wanted to recognise our campaign that's calling for an end to the globally accepted practice of allowing companies to incorporate whilst keeping their real owners hidden. This is something that allows all manner of corrupt deals, tax evading deals, drug trafficking, people trafficking, you name it, serious horrible crimes, usually move the money using a company with hidden owners, which is why we're very pleased that the UK has just said it will bring in a register of the real owners of companies. We've also campaigned for 15 years for new laws that would require oil and mining companies to disclose what they pay to governments. Now, this is on the basis that the people of Nigeria might stand a chance of holding their government to account for the missing oil billions if they knew how much should have been paid in the first place. That we've now won new laws in Washington and in Brussels that would make this happen. But some of the oil companies are trying to gut these laws. I wonder what they're so worried is going to come out if they have to reveal their payments. We'll come back to that in a moment, because I should perhaps first explain how on earth I got here. So I started out as a journalist, thinking that that would be my way to change the world. But I soon became rather frustrated just writing the stories, one after the other. And so I became a campaigner, and I campaigned for several years for controls on the arms trade. But I became rather down, dealing only with the supply of horrible hardware and not the economic injustices that so often lead to the demand for it. And so I became an aid worker, and I found myself in Sierra Leone, just at the end of a civil war which had been going on for 10 years. And that is when I started to understand the resource curse firsthand. Sierra Leone is fabulously wealthy in natural resources, diamonds, gold, bauxite, titanium. But the diamonds had just fueled a civil war, and the people were some of the poorest on earth. In one of the main diamond towns I went to, there was just one main road through the middle of the town, and half of the shops on it were diamond dealerships. They weren't selling diamonds, they were packed to the ceilings with TVs and stereos and generators and bicycles, which they were using to pay the local diggers, who were bringing in diamonds worth many times more. The other half of the road was aid agency compounds, one after the other. And apart from a few stalls on the street, that was it for economic life in this town. Now, there's something going really wrong when a country's natural resource wealth is not only failing to benefit ordinary people, but is destabilizing politics and fueling war. The aid work I was involved in was wonderful and seemed to be much needed. We were helping to reunite displaced children with their families. We were supporting the reintegration into their communities of girls who'd been abducted and raped by the rebels and forced to be their wives. And we were raising funds for an amputee football team who played the most extraordinary football on crutches. But as long as the majority of those natural resource revenues continued to make their way mostly into companies' coffers and government officials' offshore private bank accounts, then I felt like I was pouring water into a leaky bucket. In short, the problem was much closer to home. And so now here I find myself back here in London, my city that is one of the foremost butlers to the world's corrupt. Now you're right, there is plenty of corrupt money in Dubai and Singapore too, but this one's my city, this is the city I live in. This one's my city, full of bank accounts stuffed with corrupt cash, my city full of lawyers and accountants and trust and company service providers who spend their days setting up shell companies whose only purpose is to move money from one place to another. Let's look at that financial sector. A couple of years ago, our banking regulator finally admitted that 3/4 of British banks weren't doing enough to establish what were the source of the funds that their customers were depositing, which is basically an acknowledgement that the UK is wide open to corrupt funds. Now, having corrupt funds in our bank accounts here is not just a side effect of that corruption that's happening over there somewhere. It's precisely what allows it to happen. It's what allows the dictator to shore up his undemocratic power, to keep funds off budget and out of sight of his opponents, and to line up a bolt hole for when it all goes wrong. There is simply no point in stealing billions of dollars if you have to keep it under the bed. It doesn't fit, for starters, but you want to go and put it somewhere where you can enjoy it. As a Nigerian anti-corruption investigator put it to us, if you're going to fly a plane, you don't take off until you know where you're going to land. We know Ukrainian activists who are hopping mad that their country's fledgling democracy has been repeatedly undermined by a trail of corruption that leads straight back here to London. $23 million in funds associated with the regime that's just gone has now been frozen in the UK. Too late, we'd say. And it turns out that the ex-president's palace was part-owned by a UK shell company. So that's the finance sector. Let's have a quick look at property. Now, London's booming property market isn't particularly popular with our own generation rent who can't afford to find somewhere to live, but it's very popular with international hot money looking for somewhere to hang out for a while. The Financial Times recently did an analysis of land registry data to show that over a 13-year period to 2012, 40,000 properties in London alone were bought using offshore companies. That basically means no one knows who they belong to. Now, the tax fiddling reasons for using an offshore company to buy your house are increasingly recognised, but corrupt money likes property too. One of those 40,000 houses would have been the £10 million house up in Hampstead, owned by one of Colonel Gaddafi's sons through a British Virgin Islands company. And another 4 properties in North London were owned, again through a British Virgin Islands company, by one of those corrupt Nigerian state governors I mentioned earlier, who paid for them using bribes and the proceeds of ripping off his people, the people who voted for him. You usually only find out about properties like this once the person involved is prosecuted or pushed from power, which doesn't happen often enough. So that's the property market. And then there's our ancient and venerable legal system. Let me tell you a story about that. So look, imagine that you have plans to rob a bank. Imagine that you come to an arrangement with one of your accomplices as to how much he's going to be paid. Imagine that your accomplice then takes you to court to claim his fee, and the court makes a decision as to how much he's entitled to without referring to the fact that a bank has just been robbed. That is basically what's just happened here in the High Court in London, except that the man involved hadn't been robbing a bank. He'd been robbing the people of Nigeria of $1.1 billion. And this is how it happened. Two oil companies, Shell and Italy's Eni, bought a lucrative offshore Nigerian oil block for $1.1 billion. They paid this money to the government of Nigeria, which then made a subsequent payment for an identical amount to a company called Malibu Oil and Gas, which was secretly owned by the former Nigerian oil minister. He had awarded his own company, whilst he was in office, this concession, and was now cashing in on his corruption. Now, Shell and Eni point out that they paid their money to the government of Nigeria, but court documents show that their representatives met the former oil minister, who's called Dan Etete, on a number of occasions while the negotiations were going on, and that they knew he was representing this company, Malibu. When the $1.1 billion reached Malibu, 800 million of it was immediately wired on to another 5 companies with hidden owners, so nobody knows who's benefited. It certainly isn't the Nigerian people. So we can already see 2 things from this: how corruption can happen behind companies with hidden owners, and why those new laws that I mentioned earlier, which would require oil and mining companies to disclose their payments, would have been a really good idea in this case, so that the Nigerian people could see the deals being done on their behalf. Interestingly, Shell is one of the oil companies lobbying against those laws. Anyway, so when the middleman took Malibu to court to claim his fee, it all came out. The court made a finding of fact that the oil minister was the real owner of this company, which is essentially an acknowledgement that this is a seriously dodgy deal. And yet the court awarded the middleman his cut. He got about $110 million. We find this extraordinary. Even more extraordinary is that the CPS and other authorities have not frozen this payment in order to stop him getting it. It's deals like this which help to explain why billions of dollars of Nigerian oil revenue still go missing every year. It's deals like this which help to explain why a larger proportion of Nigerian people live in poverty than before the oil money started to flow. The UK, meanwhile, gives £275 million a year of development aid to Nigeria. I am not suggesting that we stop the aid. I've seen for myself what good aid can do. I am suggesting, though, that we stop fueling the corruption that undermines that aid and prevents oil revenues reaching ordinary people. I am suggesting that we don't let our courts legitimise corrupt deals. I am suggesting that we stop our banks accepting corrupt money. And I am suggesting that perhaps it's time for the land registry to record the real owners of properties, and not just the offshore companies that they're hiding behind. I am basically suggesting that we try and make London a place where those who want to go and work in finance and property and law can do so if they choose, without helping to fuel the corruption that keeps so many people still living in poverty. Thank you.